This, as you've probably guessed, is the secret to persuading Republicans. I'm the founder of Smart Politics, and so we call these Smart Politics tools for influencing hearts and changing minds. There we go. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Karin Tamerius, and I'm a political psychiatrist. There aren't very many of us in the world, and so let me tell you a little bit about what that means. First off, I'm trained in political science with an emphasis in political psychology. I got my bachelor's degree from Berkeley in political science and did a bunch of graduate study in political science at the University of Michigan. And then I totally changed course and went to medical school and became a psychiatrist. Since the 2016 election, I've kind of merged those two worlds into the field of political psychiatry, combining my clinical practice skills with my political acumen and offering these tools so that you can be more effective in the political realm. Joining me tonight is Locke Petersheim, who is the Smart Politics content manager and an all-around great guy. He assists with writing because he's a copywriter. He's also a former high school teacher, so he has a lot of know-how about how to organize these materials and share them in a way that others can really grasp. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, and let's get going with the agenda. So tonight we are going to be talking about the 3 secrets to persuading Republicans. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a teaser here. The 3 secrets are: first, do no harm; second, talk to the elephant, not the rider; and third, facilitate change, don't force it. Once we get through all of that, there's going to be plenty of time for question and answer. And then the best part, at least to me, is we're going to do a demo with the AI Angry Uncle Bot, which I developed to help people practice having these conversations before you actually move out into the real world. There we go. So let's start with the 3 secrets to persuading Republicans. I'm having a lot of trouble with my thing today. There we go. Number 1, first, do no harm. And one of the things I find really helpful here for understanding persuasion is to understanding that persuasion is paradoxical. The more we try to change someone's mind, the less influence we have. The actually less susceptible they are to the things we're trying to get them to do or the things we're trying to get them to think. And that paradox weaves its way through all of our interactions with people we disagree with. So the question always confronting us is, how do we navigate this paradox so that we actually can be persuasive? And if we want to understand why this paradox exists, the fundamental reason is that people easily become defensive when we're trying to get them to do something they aren't already predisposed to do. I'm sure you've all encountered someone in a political conversation who just immediately puts up walls and doesn't, maybe they fight back, or maybe they walk away, or maybe they just kind of freeze in place and don't seem to really be listening to anything you have to say. That's a sign that the person is really in a defensive place and they're not ready to hear what you have to say. Before we dive into the solution to that problem, I want to talk about the 4 different kinds of psychological defenses that you're likely to encounter in political conversations. As we go through these, I think you'll realize that you see these all the time, even if you don't you didn't necessarily realize before that's what you were seeing. So let's consider first reactance. Reactance is what psychologists consider to be an aversive feeling that arises whenever someone tries to tell us what to do or to control us. People have an innate need to feel autonomous. We want to make choices about whether or not to do things or think things. And the more people try to control that, the more we push back. And as a result of this innate reactance, a lot of times people will resist things even when they're in their best interest. So, for example, we saw that a lot during COVID when, there were mask mandates and vaccination, strong admonitions to get vaccinated. A lot of times people resisted those things simply because they were being forced to do them. When they were given more of a freedom of choice, then they felt less controlled and were more willing to entertain the possibility of taking those precautions. Reactance shows up in life, particularly during two phases. One is with 2-year-olds, when it's that moment when they start telling you no. Up to that point, they were pretty much going along with you as a parent. And then the other place you really notice it is with teenagers. Teenagers become much less cooperative and much less willing to just do something because you told them to do it. So reactance exists throughout the lifespan, but it really gets heightened during those two periods. Another type of defense that we see are ego defenses. And I have a picture here of Sigmund Freud because we associate these ego defenses primarily with him and his daughter, Anna Freud. Ego defenses are safeguards to protect us from having bad thoughts and bad feelings, especially bad thoughts and feelings about ourselves. So these are things that protect our self-esteem and maintain our emotional stability and equanimity in the face of major emotionally threatening occurrences. Some of the most common ego defenses you probably encounter are things like projection, denial, rationalization, and intellectualization. One of my favorite examples, of course, comes from Trump's debate, one of Trump's debates with Hillary Clinton, when he said, "I'm not a puppet, you're a puppet." Classic example of a very primitive defense in terms of projection. Another type of defense that's really important for us to keep in mind in politics are group defenses. Now, this is a guy you're probably not familiar with. It's Henry Tajfel. And he was the guy who figured out that in-group, out-group attitudes are really important. It matters what group you're in terms of how you see the world. These defenses protect us from losing our social identity and our connection to our group. Throughout human history, people were dependent upon their groups to survive. If you were thrown out of your tribe, you couldn't make it on your own. And so we've evolved all of these defenses to make it as likely as possible that we won't get thrown out. So these group defenses protect our belonging to the group and also our social status. We get a lot of public esteem by protecting the group in our thinking and our behavior. Some of the things that you'll notice that really are the tip-offs that group defenses are taking place are idealization of the in-group. So we tend to see people in the in-group as being better than they are, and also denigration of the outgroup, seeing people who are not in our group as being worse than they actually are. And the final type of belief system and defense that is really important to keep in mind defense system is the belief system defense. This safeguards our worldview. All of us have a belief system about how the world works that helps us know what to do next. It tells us how to behave in the world, what to expect, and what is moral and what is immoral. When that belief system is disrupted in some way, it can be really hard to know how to make good decisions, who to trust, who not to trust, what to do next, what to expect in the future. And so we really cling to our beliefs about the world because they make us feel secure. This becomes the basis of things like the confirmation bias, which means our tendency to see information not as contradictory to our worldview, but as supportive of our worldview, whether or not it actually is. And it's why we tend to be very dismissive of alternative evidence and arguments in favor of our existing worldview, even if the alternative evidence and arguments are fairly strong. Our belief system has served us very well up to this point. We know that because we're still alive. Taking a risk on a new belief system can be very dangerous potentially. And so we're always going to err on the side of caution and protect our existing beliefs before considering something new. So in light of these 4 defense systems or 4 types of defenses, what we can take away from that is that there are 4 things that really don't work when we're trying to persuade people because they just butt up against those defenses. The first is telling people what to do or trying to control them because that hits up against reactance. The second is making people feel bad, especially about themselves, because that hits up against ego defenses. The third is threatening someone's sense of social identity or belonging, especially by ostracizing them, because that makes them feel like their group is in danger or that they're losing access to the group that defends them. And finally, when we attack someone's worldview, even with facts and reason, we butt up against the belief defense system, which protects people's view of the world and provides them with a sense of security. So what do we do next? Before we go there, I want to take a moment to see if there are some questions.
Yeah, Susan shared something with me, and this happens to me a lot, is I think I'm sending something to the group and it's going to private. I'm going to share this in the group chat and then I can read it out to you to get this right. Okay. And then somebody else?
Oh, I think it's here.
I see what you said, Susan. Yeah. So Susan, oh, there it is. Okay. Oh, everywhere. All right, you got it.
All right. So she said, I was reading something today about how hating the same people feels good and promotes group cohesion and how much they do that, but so do we. I would like to stop doing that. Yeah. I think that is a really good goal to have. And I think it's really important to recognize that this is a human trait. This is not a Democratic or Republican trait or a left or right trait. This is something that we all are prone to, which is no matter who our group is. We tend to see our group as being better than, superior to, more moral than whoever the people are that don't belong to our group. And working on that is a great goal to have, as long as we recognize we're probably never going to eliminate that from our character. It's something innate. How do you get people to abandon the tribal mentality and see politics as a process with the goal to benefit all? Great question. As I just said, we are always going to be inherently tribal because we evolved that way. We evolved depending on our tribes to survive. And so our brains are actually wired to figure out who our groups are and to see them as superior to those on the outside. I think the best trick, though, for approaching this problem, particularly in the setting of political conversation, is to always try to be expanding the category of us. So rather than talking about us being Democrats, I always try to focus on us as being Americans, us being citizens, us being humanity, us being people of the world. And you just have to be very conscious in naming the group over and over again to prime that way of thinking, to see us as being a member of a collective rather than as being parts of separate groups. Anything else, Locke, or are we good to go?
I think we're all right.
Okay. So moving on. Secret number 2, talk to the elephant, not to the rider. So for this part, it helps to know a little bit about how persuasion works. Up to this point, we've really concentrated on why persuasion is so difficult, right? People are really defensive, and all of those defenses get in the way. But we can understand persuasion as working through 2 modes. It's called the dual process model of persuasion. And basically what researchers have found is that the brain processes persuasive messages in 2 ways. There is first a fast, intuitive, kind of gut level assessment, and then there's a slow, reasoned, effortful analysis. And most of us, when we think about persuasion, we really think about that kind of slow, reasoned, effortful analysis, right? We're thinking about having debates and walking people through the evidence and making arguments and all that kind of stuff. But what's really interesting is the dual process model shows us that reason isn't actually all that important to persuasion. In fact, intuition is far more important than reason. We use intuition constantly, and that kind of reasoned assessment actually doesn't happen very often at all. If you're wondering why, the reason is actually pretty simple. Engaging in logic and reason and analysis is really resource intensive. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, and we don't have all those resources to constantly be engaging in that type of assessment of the information that's coming to us. So we rely on a lot of shortcuts in the form of psychological heuristics or intuition in order to make rapid assessments. And so that's how we get through most of our existence. One way that really helps, I think, to understand this is to take advantage of a metaphor that was created by Jonathan Haidt, who is a social psychologist. And he argued that the best way to understand the way the mind works with persuasion is to think of the mind as divided between a rider on an elephant. So you think of the mind as being divided in two parts, where one part is the rider and one part is the elephant. The elephant is the part of our mind that is really intuitive and emotional. It's persuaded by those gut feelings. And the rider is that part of the mind that is persuaded by facts and reason. Now, the really important thing to grasp about this metaphor is that if the elephant doesn't want to go somewhere, the rider can't force it. So while it seems like the reasonable rider is in charge, in reality, the emotional elephant has all the power in the relationship. And even worse than that, usually the rider is trying to hide the fact that they're powerless by rationalizing the elephant's desires. So even though they often seem like they're reasoning, in reality, what they're doing is rationalizing or justifying the wishes of the elephant. So why is this so problematic? It means that successful influence is mostly about persuading elephants. But we, those of us who are trying to be persuasive in our political communications, waste all of our time and energy talking to riders. We're trying to persuade the riders when the elephants have all the power. And we often scare the elephants in the process. So what's the answer? The solution is to stop talking with riders and start communicating with elephants instead. And I know a lot of you are thinking, I didn't come here to learn how to be an elephant whisperer, but I promise I'm going to give you some tips to help you out with that. So one thing that can help you think about this is first consider what an elephant is, because this metaphor works on multiple levels. Elephants are kind of skittish, nervous creatures, right? We all know the idea that an elephant is actually scared by mice. I don't know if that's actually true, but I think that gets at the idea that elephants are easily frightened. They are emotional. They are highly social, living in herds and having emotional ties between them. They aren't particularly interested in facts and reason, and they're pretty set in their ways. They don't like novelty. They're creatures of habit. So what does this mean for us? It means that if we want to persuade elephants, we've got to earn their trust. And so what I'm interested in introducing now is what I call the trust pyramid, which is a pyramid, a hierarchical listing, basically, of what it takes to earn the trust of an elephant, and primarily in a political conversation. The way the pyramid works is it starts at the bottom and you work your way up. So the things at the bottom are the most important. The things at the top are the least important. And you can't build a pyramid from the bottom down. If as you're, in the middle of the pyramid working on those areas, if you let the stuff on the bottom go, the whole thing is going to crumble apart. So let's go through the basics of the pyramid. At the bottom, the absolutely most important thing you need to do first in a conversation with an elephant is to make them feel safe enough to open up with you. Okay, so if you are making a lot of noise and communicating that they are bad or evil, they're going to take off. they're not gonna open up. They're not gonna take any risks with you. So first, make them feel comfortable. The second thing you need to do is establish a real connection. And that means finding some things that you like about each other. And that often means finding some things that you have in common and that you can bond over. One of the things that I find really easy is to bond with Republicans over being a parent, right? We have a lot of the same experiences, even if we have very different political views in some ways. The next level in the pyramid is comprehension. You need to learn their point of view and be able to see the world from their perspective. That doesn't mean that you need to agree with their perspective, just that you need to be able to get that, okay, if I accept your premise, then maybe I can kind of see where you're coming from, right? And it doesn't mean that you have all the same feelings that they do, but being able to recognize that they have feelings and those feelings are valid is super important. Another thing that's also important is to show that you care and that you don't want them to suffer. A lot of times we go into these conversations and we forget about the emotions of the people we're talking with, which is interesting because those of us on the left tend to think of ourselves as like incredibly compassionate and caring people. And yet when we talk with Republicans, a lot of times our compassion goes out the window, and they notice that. Right? So it's really important to tap into some compassion within yourself for their experience, whatever it may be. And finally, at the very top of the pyramid, you need to establish your credibility as a person. And that means things like showing that you're trying to be as unbiased as possible. Maybe you're not perfect, none of us are, but at least you're making an effort to be unbiased. Showing them that you're humble, that you recognize that you don't have all the answers, and that you admit when you make a mistake. Trying to be open-minded yourself and not just demanding that they be open-minded. All of these things are going to raise your credibility in the eyes of the person you're talking with. So, what happens when you climb that pyramid and earn the elephant's trust? The amazing thing is that the elephant wants to follow you. You no longer are in the position of trying to drag the elephant or push the elephant. The elephant trusts you and therefore is interested in hearing what you have to say. And not only that, because the elephant likes you so much, the elephant actually wants to reduce the distance between you, wants to find ways to reduce the cognitive dissonance that may be pulling you apart. And at that point, once you've gotten the elephant's buy-in, now you can really open up and talk with the rider a little bit. As long as you do it without spooking the elephant, but we'll get to that. So moving on, looks like we don't have any new questions on here. What about you, Locke? Any in the chat?
Yeah, a couple things. Jennifer says, for the same reason people bond over common dislikes. We were talking about earlier about how we like hating the same things together. They also bond over common likes, which gets to your whole point of connection.
Right, right.
Then,
Absolutely.
unfortunately, oh, sorry, go ahead. But
oh, I just said absolutely.
Yeah. FU says, sorry, FU. sometimes encounter a person who seems like they might be persuaded, who may have some doubts, who are considering the right concepts, but are clearly terrified to quote unquote stray from the herd with different ideas, and therefore have different ideas from their group, to be disliked and exiled from the group. How do I get past that? And that's, I don't know if that comes up later, but
Yeah, I think
the idea.
let's do this next section. And if you're still wondering, we'll dive into that again.
Yeah, a little more here. Susan says, find that I totally understand why some of my Republican neighbors are alarmed at progressive ideas, because they are reacting to the loss of societal privileges and power. I get that, understand it totally, reject it as how we proceed as a country.
Yeah, exactly. So you can show compassion for that and show that you get it, while simultaneously holding strong to your beliefs. Those are not incompatible things.
Yeah, and a lot of what you're going to see tonight is asks us sometimes to do things that are difficult for us, which is to take our beliefs and our feelings, like Susan says about rejecting privileges and power, and put them in a little bit of a lockbox during the first part of the conversation. In the first part of the conversation, you're building connection, you're building comfort and trust. And so you don't lead with all of the things you disagree about. You look for things you agree about, and then later you can get to the sharing. This is where you would like to question them about things you disagree with them with.
Yep, exactly. All right, moving on.
Yep.
So, secret number 3, foster change, don't force it. And this is really the heart of the smart politics method in a lot of ways. Oops, I think I advanced two slides. All right, so this is the persuasion conversation cycle. It's a 5-step process for having a conversation with someone, especially someone you disagree with. And it serves both as a tool for earning the elephant's trust, for climbing that pyramid, and for persuading the rider. You can do both of those things as you're going through the cycle. So what I'm going to do first here is walk you through each of these steps in the cycle and explain a little bit about how it works. So the first step in the cycle is to ask questions. If you're going into a conversation and you're really the one initiating it, the best way to do that is to ask a very open-ended, non-judgmental, curious question that invites the other person to share their perspective. You don't go into a conversation sharing your views and then expecting them to listen to you. One of the things about all the work we do in smart politics is it does assume that you're really the one carrying the burden for this work. After all, you're the one who wants to persuade them. So if you want them to be persuaded, you're going to have to do the work in the dialogue. The next step in the cycle is to listen to the answer. And it always sounds so simple, but the reality is listening is hard, particularly in our culture where listening tends to just be taking turns talking or listening to reply rather than listening to understand. Learning to listen in a way that actually makes a difference takes practice. And it means you have to pay close attention to what the other person is saying and turn down the sound of that chatter in your own head that's telling you that what they're saying is wrong. What matters isn't what you think in that moment, but what they think. You are going to try to tune in to what they believe and try to understand their perspective rather than preparing your rebuttal, which I know is what most of us do when we're having a conversation. And then the last thing you really need to do is fully listen to them. And part of what that involves is letting them talk as long as they want. A lot of times when you first start getting into a conversation with a Republican, what you'll discover is that they have a lot to say once they actually feel safe enough to say it. So be prepared to hang in there and take some deep breaths and just endure, because eventually they will get it all out, but it can take a while in the process. The third step in the cycle is to reflect back what you hear. And reflecting basically means summarizing the gist of their comments. You don't need to give a summary that is word for word. You don't have to cover all their points. You don't have to make sure you reiterate everything they said. But you want to make it clear to them that you really have been listening and trying your best to understand where they're coming from. Really good reflections include not only a summary of what the other person said, but also includes naming their emotions, like were they worried or angry or scared, what was kind of behind that, underlying the emotions, and also some recapitulation of the implicit content that is often contained. Like they may have expressed a particular view without going into their reasons why. And yet, simply from listening, you may get a sense of what their reasons why, and it's okay to kind of raise those up and say, and make a guess about what that implicit content is. And these reflections serve really two functions. The first, as I said, is to show them that you're trying to understand where they're coming from. But also, it acts as a check on your understanding. A lot of times we think we understand where the other person is coming from. And actually, we're pretty far off. And so by forcing us to go through this exercise of summarizing their perspective, we give them an opportunity to say, no, actually, that's not quite right. And then you can say, oh, I'm sorry, can you explain it to me again so I make sure that I really have heard you? Going through that is really important for building a strong relationship. It's essential for establishing that comprehension portion of the pyramid. And it can also be really valuable for giving them an opportunity to hear their own words back to them. And sometimes you'll find when someone hears their own words back, spoken back to them, that actually they start to change their opinion right then on their own without you doing anything. Oops. Okay. The fourth step in the cycle is validate. Validate means acknowledging the legitimacy of their beliefs and feelings, even though you may disagree with most of what they have said. It means accepting their experience as, theirs, and you are not in a position to question their experience. If they feel persecuted, that's, that you have no position in challenging their persecution. That is their feeling, and you have to accept that. Perhaps the most important part of validating is agreeing where possible. And in my experience, there are some things that are really easy to agree on and some things that are really hard to agree on. In general, I try to stay away from the 3 Ps, politicians, policies, and parties. And also often I stay away from facts. Instead, I focus on goals, values, and emotions, because those are things that you can almost always agree on. And the final step in the cycle is to share. And I know it's really hard to not go to share first. That's where we all want to start. But you have to go through ask, listen, reflect, and validate before you go to share. And it doesn't matter how valid your point of view is, how well supported by evidence. If you share it earlier, they won't be able to hear you. The reason we go through all the work of ask, listen, reflect, and validate is to climb that pyramid and get them to a place where they trust you enough to actually hear what you have to say. But that said, even when you're talking with the writer, you have to be really careful about how you go about sharing. And you really need, for example, to stay away from arguing with facts and reason. And the reason for that is because of the belief defense system. The belief defense system is really tricky. Whenever you try to present a reasoned argument, it's going to kick in. Even if you have earned their trust and built a great relationship. If they can tell that you are, mounting an attack on their carefully curated beliefs, their trust in you is going to begin to crumble. So instead, you have to kind of work around that. And one of the most powerful ways to work around that we've found is to, instead of making an argument, to share a story or share an anecdote. And so if there's a topic that you're discussing, for example, let's say you're talking about climate change and they don't believe in climate change, instead of presenting them with a bunch of facts and figures about why climate change is real, global warming is happening, present a story about how you or someone you know has personally been impacted by recent changes in weather patterns. That's a way to connect that doesn't trigger the belief defense system. Also, that information becomes more solidly lodged in their memory. Research shows that information in stories is remembered when information presented as an argument is forgotten. And also it allows people to empathize when they can't empathize with an argument, but in the form of a story, you can actually reach that part of their brain that can imagine themselves in someone else's perspective. The final point I'll make on the sharing is I know a lot of times people want to share important information, like they want to go out there and share a movie or share a book. And in general, that doesn't work real well, but if you feel you must do that, it's really important to only do that after you've gotten the other person's consent. Don't go to them and say, hey, I've got this really great book, just read it and you'll understand where I'm coming from. First, you've got to say, hey, I think, one of the ways we can understand each other a little better is if we shared some information with each other. And I read this book that really had a big influence on my thinking. And I wonder if you might be interested in looking at it too. If they say yes, then at that point, go ahead, share it with them. That's great. But otherwise, don't do it, because chances are they're not going to listen, and it's going to generate reactance, that feeling that you're trying to control them. And the last thing I want to talk about here is kind of how we can use the persuasion conversation cycle to persuade the writer. All 5 of the steps can be important once you've earned the trust of the elephant, but there are ways that you can think about your subsequent engagement as really shifting the writer gently rather than forcing it. So one of the big ways to do that is to motivate change. One of the big barriers that we run into when we're trying to persuade people is that people are pretty happy the way they are. You know, it's risky to change, and they don't have a great desire to do so on their own. And so one way that you can make conversations motivate change is by eliciting inconsistencies and highlighting ambivalence. And what I mean by that is ask them for stories about where their beliefs are coming from and get them to talk about a topic as much as you can. And while you listen, pay attention to places where there's tension or inconsistency in what they're saying. Now, when you pick up on that, don't go, hey, you're being hypocritical. That's not good. That's going to scare the elephant. But what you can say is, it sounds like you're being pulled in 2 directions here. On the one hand, you really want a clean environment, but on the other hand, you're kind of skeptical of claims about the severity of the effects of CO2 in the atmosphere on global temperatures. When you do that, you give them control of figuring out how they're going to resolve these tensions, but it necessarily generates a feeling in them, this sense of cognitive dissonance, which is uncomfortable. That makes them feel like, I do need to figure that out. You're right. The next thing that needs to happen is there are ways for you to catalyze change with the persuasion conversation cycle. So instead of thinking of yourself as being there to make arguments and educate them, think of yourself as being a really awesome teacher who is there to facilitate learning and facilitate the inherent potential of the person you're talking with. Your job is to figure out what they want to know and help them learn it. So instead of saying, here, read this, say to them, is there something more that you'd like to know about this topic? And when they say yes, then say, okay, well, maybe we can look into this together, right? So do it as a team, investigate the information. And another thing that you can do is offer emotional support. Change is hard. Learning is hard. Provide encouragement throughout the process. Rather than making them feel bad because they haven't already changed, make them feel good that they're being curious and investing in learning more. And finally, once they do start to change and seem like they're going to a new place, help stabilize that change. A lot of times people start to make a shift and then they fall backwards. And they fall backwards in part because all of the other forces in their environment are pushing on them and keeping them in that place. And so one of your jobs is to help them find a way to integrate their new belief system so that it actually makes more sense to them than where they were before. So that going backwards just feels wrong. And a lot of the way you do that is just by talking more and listening more so they can kind of talk it out loud rather than expecting them to do all of that work on their own.